everyone for joining and tuning in today. I have the great honor and pleasure of speaking with the wonderful bassist Rufus Reid. So thank you for joining me today.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you, Patty.
I'm really excited to talk to you about so many things, but since we have a limited hour here, I want to make sure that we're covering maybe some new territory that aren't covered in other interviews that you have.
That'd be good,
But
yes.
But I'd also like to talk to you about your time at William Patterson, since my program, also being the Wayne Public Library, has to do with that. But one of the things I just want to start out with is you, like many of the musicians in the faculty, wear many hats. And I'm just going to give you my bullet list of the different hats that you wear. You're a
Okay.
musician, you're a author, you're a composer, you're an arranger, educator, a contributor, and a leader. And that's quite a lot to have accomplished in a fairly short amount of time, I think.
Well, I think that's what happens. I don't really think about it too much, to be honest. It's just you do what needs to be done at that time. Um, but I guess when you start listing like that, it might sound like a mouthful. Yeah.
There are several different topics I want to touch on, but I think I'm going to start with your compositions, and then we'll talk about you being an educator and what information you've imparted to those you've taught, and we'll see where the conversation flows. So
Okay.
I know that you, when you retired in 1999, you took that as an opportunity to focus on the things you've been wanting to do. And I think your wife encouraged you also to. And so you were able to devote more time to composition. And I also have quite a long list of the compositions you've done. What is the one that you're the proudest of? Although it's like children, you can't be, necessarily going
Yes. I guess now, because the first one was when I was involved with the BMI Composers Workshop, and that one was pretty amazing because the first one took almost a year to write, because they said, "Well, write what you want to write," and I did not know what I wanted to write, and most composers or arrangers write things are fairly prescribed for them, whatever it happens to be. Except this time they said, none of that exists. Just write what you want to write. And that was a true um, stumbling block for me because I never thought about what I liked. And so it took me quite a while to kind of get the ball rolling. And um, but it did come out, and the piece that ended up being the commissioned piece was called "Whims of the Bluebird," and I like listening to it now. I've learned a lot from it. It it could breathe a little bit more in the middle, but it's a lot of stuff in it, and I guess that's where I was at that time. But uh, that I'm very proud of, and I've heard it played really well. And um, but things have changed over the years. You fast forward like 20, 21 or 22 years later, I'm expanding myself by writing uh, with different instrumentations, but and also maybe a different genre. What's been exciting to me because I've began to listen to all kinds of music. I had some friends of mine who were phenomenal musicians, phenomenal creative people, but they would always say, "No, you should listen to stuff, even if you don't like it right away. You might find something in it that you can use." And so, but I like melodies, and I listen to a lot of classical music, European classical music. the obvious Bach, Beethoven, Mozart, etc. Um, and but I just finished a string orchestra piece that I just found out that it's going to be premiered in August, this coming August, um, and I'm really excited about that. I just finished a string quartet that just got recorded, although it hasn't been released yet. The person who commissioned 16 jazz composers to write a string quartet, but not a jazz string quartet, whatever that is, but just a string quartet, because jazz musicians just think differently in terms of how things lay out, and it it has been recorded. Hopefully, in the next couple months, it will. The gentleman is going to begin to releasing these things. I'm pretty excited about that. And what's the most exciting thing is that if somebody heard it and didn't see my name written, they would not associate me with any of that music. And that I'm really happy about, because quite often to write out of my idiom, I'm known as a jazz bass player, and so I can't know about anything else. I mean, that's unfair, but a lot of people go there, and so I've written 2 full orchestra pieces that have been performed, uh, um, and these 2 new pieces, I'm really excited because it's a totally different animal for me. And but I'm still writing some jazz things with the big band. I just finished doing a residency at Princeton, down in Princeton, where they played all my music, and that was challenging and fun, you know. So it's been kind of exciting period for me.
You brought up the fact that many people don't think of jazz musicians as being able, not being able to, but identify them with classical compositions. And as we're talking, there were several that came to mind that I wondered if it was any influence to you. So I was thinking of Duke Ellington wrote Reflections in D. When I hear Monty Alexander, I hear a lot of like Debussy in his music. J.J. Johnson has his composition El Camino Real, and Oscar
Right.
Peterson has Canadiana Suite. Like, were any of these
Exactly.
influences to you?
Well, yes, but see, the thing is, I think jazz musicians, by and large, particularly the ones that you just mentioned, um, they're worldly, and they listen to the music that's important. And I mean, J.J. Johnson loved Mahler just because of that big, huge brass. I mean, he would just rave about that. And the I mean, there's this Bill Evans record that was made in the late '60s with Klaus Ogerman, and that turned my head around. I mean, it was just gorgeous, and it still sounds great today. And so I'm not trying to be what I'm not, although you know, when you're in school, when I was at Northwestern, and we have music classes and music appreciation and all that stuff. And I I listened to a lot of stuff, but I didn't really hear it, except for what I had to. Now, as I've gotten older and I listen to all, I actually hear it. I I hear the first time I actually played in a symphony orchestra was at Northwestern. I had been playing. I was out of the military, but I was almost 6 or 7 years older than the freshmen that were coming into the schools. And so I'll never forget this day because people have been telling me about, oh man, you ought to hear the orchestra. It's a great sound and all this. And I didn't poo-poo it. I mean, there are a lot of people who poo-poo jazz. That must not be much of anything. Everybody's faking it anyway. Um, but when I heard this, we were playing Eroica, and I played this low note on the bass, and I heard this enormous chord from the entire orchestra, and I said, "Oh my God!" And then I got it. Then I began to understand what people were telling me about, and then I began to really listen that much more. But now I'm actually listening almost daily to something different, just to get my head into something else. And the string orchestra piece that I just finished, actually it was in November I finished it, but I studied adagio for strings for months, just because I had the score and then I could listen to it. And he's written, there's nothing but quarter notes and half notes, and it's an unbelievable piece of music, and then when I listened to Ravel first and only string quartet, which was over 100+ years, it sounds. If I could write like that today, I'd be cool. I'd be happy. So so it's kind of inspirationally to go back and then listen, not trying to imitate, because that's a drag. Because that's, and yet everybody's inspired by something. And of course, people say, if you're going to steal something, steal from the best, but there's nothing new out here. It may just have a new dressing on it, how people look at it. But it's very exciting me. I think the most thing for me is the process. I could spend hours just thinking about stuff.
I think I had a notation that it was a Guggenheim Fellowship that allows you to really appreciate the process of composition and build on that.
Right, because I wanted to learn this different animal that I was not accustomed to. I mean, I've been to orchestra concerts, and having played trumpet before, I know what French horns sound like, blah 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 blah. And my teachers were from the Chicago Symphony, so I know a great sound when I hear it, but it's nothing to write for it. Oh man, it's amazing, and but it's exciting. And that the Guggenheim allowed me to learn about this, how to write for this animal, this different animal. I'm used to the quintet, the trio, the big band, jazz big band, but I wasn't a string orchestra, string quartet, full orchestra, all the woodwinds and all the percussion stuff, and it's amazing. But you have to know about it in order to write about it or write something, and then I had a gentleman who actually, I'm so thankful to him. His name was Peter Askham. He's a bassist and classical and a conductor, and he studied composition. And but he performed my very first orchestra piece up at Idlewild, above LA. You know, there's this big school for all kinds of creative people. And he looked at my score and he says, "My teacher would have flunked you. He would have thrown your score in the trash." I said, "What?" He said, "Yeah, it didn't look right." He says, "You have not only learning how to write for the orchestra, you have to learn how to orchestrate and but also make the score look inviting." And he said most conductors will look at your score, just glance at it, and if they don't like the way it looks, they throw it out. And he says, "Your music actually is not really bad at all. I like it a lot, but it will never get played because the conductors will just throw." I said, "Wow, that's really funky. That's kind of petty." And yet, that was part of the deal. And so I had to learn that. And then it also helped my jazz, the way I would lay out my scores and things being that much more articulate, you know. And so it all works together, you know.
Everything's a learning moment. It sounds like from all the things that are presented to you.
Yes, absolutely. And it's very exciting. It's daunting. It can be very frustrating, and it can be exhilarating all at the same time.
So when you had the Guggenheim Fellowship, I had a notation that you wrote the three movement symphonic work, Mass Transit.
That's correct.
What's
And
that like?
well, I was thinking about I'm driving down the New Jersey Turnpike by the airport. And before you get there, you see trains going over a bridge and like 6 lanes going one way, 6 lanes going the other way, airplanes taking off, airplanes landing. Wow, what is that? And then so that would be the third movement, which is Metropolis. I think that's the name of it. And then the first one was like open roads, going back to the horse and buggy days, mass transit. That was pretty mass transit at that time. And then escalation, going up 50 years or 100 years, and then all of a sudden things are a little different. And then Metropolis is like now. So it gave me something to do, so that maybe the first movement wasn't as angular or busy. It's more open, like you're just running open fields and see horses running, and I mean that's what I was trying to just get, this kind of open feeling, and that's basically how I kind of came up with that title.
It sounds also like a very good description of New Jersey because of all the diverse little
Yeah,
microcosms that we have with the farms in the south and the suburbs in the north and
right,
coughing
exactly.
near the city. You had mentioned Bill Evans earlier and the piece that or 1960 album. I had read that you found that an inspiration because it was a trio, but it had a strings with a trio. And so you have two albums that are with the Sirius Quartet that is a trio. The first being with Newvelle Records, Terrestrial Dance.
Right. Now that was on vinyl,
Right.
and so that was very exciting because the when I found out about this new label on vinyl, I said, "Wow, that's interesting." When I first started recording, and I wasn't the leader of anything, we were doing albums on vinyl, and the sound is so much better if you have really good equipment and you have taken good care of the record, you know, and So this gentleman, he says, what? He says, yeah, I'd like you to do something, but I want you to do something different that you haven't done before. And I said, well, I'd love to have a string quartet play with the trio. And his eyes got big. I had said that to some other record company people years before, and they would go like, "Oh no," thinking that's gonna cost too much, or they didn't really think that was a good idea. And this guy, um, uh, his eyes lit up, and I said, so he offered the money that he was offering. I said, well, if you really want the string quartet, I'm going to have some more money, to do this. And so he came up with it. And the thing was, with this particular contract, which was different than any other, you got paid, and he paid for everything. After 2 years of the release, all the audio reverted back to me. And then I could do whatever I wanted to, except put it out on vinyl again, which would be stupid to do that anyway. But so, hence the second recording that's out now, the Celebration, we ended up adding two more pieces to that particular recording, and one that wasn't used. And so, hence, and it's like almost 4 years difference. And so, and the CD, the Newvelle is a fantastic company, but their target is audiophile people. And so there's a lot of people that never heard that music. And so when the CD came out, and of course now we had the pandemic and everybody's hooked up into that mess. So and now it came out this past October, and so I'm really happy that it has a lot more wider audience.
I mean, the benefit of streaming and CDs are now kind of almost going to be a thing of the past, I think, too, is streaming allows you to have a wider audience. But how do you feel about the quality of analog versus digital?
Well, that's a loaded question, lady. I think digitally they can enhance the CDs a little, not the CD plastic thing, but they can you can get a link now that actually gives you much more depth, but still not as much as could be on a vinyl. But you still have to have pretty damn good equipment, particularly amplifiers. Speakers are one thing for sure, but it's really the amplifier that's going to help these frequencies happen. And for me to hear the bass, hear the depth and you can feel it all around you without being nailed down, but it's just this rich when it's done correctly, and so that can spoil you, but I mean, people have become, unfortunately, a lot of young people listen to everything on this, and even with, it's not the same. They don't even have a clue if they would actually send. These are one of the things that I want the young people, even at William Patterson and all the other schools that are coming up with these really incredibly talented, precocious players, but they don't listen to music like I listened to it when I would listen. We would get our group together, but we would sit down and actually be quiet and turn on the speakers up loud and actually listen as a group. I mean, really listen. And I venture to say there's a lot of players of today don't really listen like that. They listen by themselves. And it's just different. And it's just like you and I are able to communicate by giving some space and then listening and then responding. Um, when you're all by yourself, you can enjoy it, and you probably really do enjoy it, but you can't really hear stuff. Um, what we used to do is, as a group, we would listen to this new record that just came out that we couldn't wait to hear, and we would turn it over 2 or 3 times, and then we would rehearse as a group with this. Oh man, these got new songs to deal with, and um, I don't feel that that's happening this same way. And I don't expect the playing field is totally different now than it was when I was coming up, but that doesn't mean you can't listen. You
You gave me a perfect segue here because I have a whole section of the wisdom about listening that you've shared.
know.
You remind me, my father being a musician, we would have parties at our house. The men would be in the living room with the stereo system, all listening to jazz records, nobody talking, all, whatever their drink of choice was, and maybe a cigar. And I remember just, sneaking down to look, and I'm like, what are they doing? They're all just standing there. And I get it now as an adult, like it totally makes sense.
Yeah.
And they were just listening and sharing. And I think for me, one of the beauties of like a gift I can give to someone is this is a song I really like, and I want you to or an album, and I want
Right.
you to listen with me and talk about it, or and it's a gift. And I don't know if our society is like that anymore.
I venture to say not. Yes, there are people who do. That's absolutely true. But it's a different mindset. Um, and I won't say that it becomes not a good habit. I won't say it's a bad habit, but it's not a good habit of keeping it to yourself, because there's a lot of things. Um, this drummer and I became real close. I said, "Man, did you hear when he switched the sticks on that the tenor player played this and that?" Oh yeah, no, go back and listen to it again. And I mean, there was like, wow, and even the really great recordings, um, the stuff that Wayne Shorter has done over the years. Just, I just, I'd been listening to a lot of recordings, and then I was talking to some people, and they said, "You should check out this album, Jeru." And I said, "Hmm, maybe I heard a little." And then I realized I really didn't know that recording as well as I thought. There was one song on it that I knew, and that was it. And it was like, wow, how did I miss that one? Wow, and it becomes. These are the things that Wayne Shorter, for me, his melodies just were infectious, and they sound simple, and some of them are simple, but they require some other things, and um, it was amazing. And he was writing up until he left us, and so I think almost everybody. JJ did, Jimmy Heath did, Slide Hampton did that, Bob Brookmeyer did. People, Thad Jones did. The people that I know personally have. Um, the writing was such a big part of their personality.
Right. So just to get back to listening, which I think you have some really sage advice here for these up and coming musicians. Is you recommend listening to other performers playing, to recordings, listen to what you're playing, which I find a really interesting uh, third part to say there. because I would assume that musicians are listening to what they're playing, but maybe they're not tapped into it.
No, it takes a minute. I started listening more about what I was playing since I was writing, because you have to think about, if you're going to write something, is it going to be a fast passage, or is it going to vertical passage, or is it going to be a linear passage? Is it going to be slow or whatever? But when I remember years ago listening to some of the recordings that I did, I listened to my solos. A lot of those, I wasn't ashamed of anything, but I would say, oh man, why did I do that? You know, I didn't really need to do that. And of course, a lot of it is experience and willing not to just show off, or because if you do have, I was never really blessed with I call it digital technique, um, being able to play really fast notes and things, because that's what jazz musicians do, you know. But thinking about now, how am I going to start this? How am I going to, am I going to dive into the pool? Am I going to do a jackknife, or am I going to do a swan, or I'm just going to get in it easy? And then uh, all these things are going in my mind, as opposed to playing, oh, this is a D minor chord, I have to play these certain notes in order to do this. I don't think like that anymore. At least I don't think so. So the writing, being able to compose, has made me think a little bit more about how I want you to hear me. And some of the more mature, J.J. Johnson was one of those guys that, and the trombone is, I mean, now there's some young players that the trombone is silly putty in their hands. I mean, they can play as articulate as saxophone players, but they don't have to. It's actually how you do it and how you get into it is really what people remember, you know. And but I really feel if people, my students now, I ask them, I say, I need you to be a little more responsible about what comes out.
I read too that you had said in the line of this thinking, you never know who's listening, so you have to give it all the time.
All the time. Because I got the job with J.J. Johnson listening. He used to practice with me on these Jamie Ebersol play along records. And so he wanted the bass player that sounds like that he practices with. And his manager happened to know me. And that's essentially how I got that gig. Uh, um, and But it's true, you never know who's listening to you, because I had the great opportunity to play with Bill Evans for a week. Um, he was looking for a new bass player. This was before Mark Johnson. And so I played a week in Boston with he and Philly Joe Jones. And I had this little Walkman, you know, a recorder, and I was recording every night. I would go back to the hotel and I'd listen. And then when I came home, or I would call my wife and I said, "Oh man, um, I can't play like I want to play." And but he came up to me. I said, "Well, you know, I don't play like Eddie Gomez." He says, "I know. I didn't want you to play like Eddie Gomez." He says, "I heard you a year and a half ago with Thad Jones and Mel Lewis band. And people have been telling me about you, but I heard you. That's why I called you." That was the best thing that anyone can tell you, but it made me feel good. And I had already made the new record with Dexter Gordon, and on the ground floor of this new band. Had I gone with Bill Evans, which would have been a bass player's dream, but I would have had to erase uh, Eddie Gomez from people's minds, which is next to impossible. And but so he, but he was very kind, and he said, I told him no, and I still think I made a good decision, but it hurt. It was hard. It was a real difficult decision, and I'm sure I would have been a different kind of player, but I don't know because I was already on the ground floor with this thing with Dexter Gordon, and I'm still reaping the benefits from that. And but I do have those memories of playing with Bill, and he respected my choice because he says I'm going to New York. I have to have someone that I'm comfortable with and a regular player. And thank you. And I said thank you and no thank you. You know, and it was bittersweet, but I do have those memories. And but when he told me he had listened to me a year and a half ago, that so I know it's true. So if you, many players sometimes save it until they go on stage, and you shouldn't save anything because it might be your last.
So you're giving me another segue here. Thank you. That you've talked about the sound of a performer. And I'm curious, as if you put on your educator hat, how do you teach students how to develop their own sound? And interestingly enough, you had also said that you can use strings or to identify or your style is a use of vibrato, but you've had other bassists use your bass and they still sound like them. So obviously,
Uh,
it's
listen,
how do you develop your own sound?
well, I think it it happens. You may not want to believe that, but I think if you continue to do and try to play your best without trying to show off or just listen to yourself and um, because I remember this International Society of Bassists convention years ago. Uh, Ray Brown played on my bass, and he sounded just like Ray Brown. I mean, just like Ray Brown. And then uh, Eddie Gomez played on my bass, and he sounds like he sounds. And people say, well, if I play on other people's bass, it I still sound like me, whatever that happens to be. And I think everyone will achieve their sound if they actually listen and they play with um, their intonation, their pitch, um, their articulation, the way that I'm speaking now. I'm trying not to speak real fast and mess up my words, and you can't really understand what the hell I'm saying. Um, I think we have to be careful to be able to play. If you really want to play really fast, then you learn to practice doing that so that it can be clear and clearer than just kind of fluffing it off. And as a bass player, I never thought about soloing for many years. Most people could care less about a bass solo, you know. And but my thing was to make the band rock. And Ray Brown always told me the first time I met him, he says, you know, the bass is in the back, but you got to keep the bass up front. It took me a while to kind of get that, but he was talking about this content of whatever he was playing. It was strong. It was, and if everyone quit, you were still there, and it was still happening. And once I got that, I said, okay, then, because every time I heard him play, whether he was just doing a solo or playing a duo, it was crystal clear. His clarity, his dynamic, his pitch, his power, his dynamic use of dynamics. You play soft, but you could hear him. You could play like powerful, like he's gonna punch you, and it was always there.
Yeah.
To me, if I can do that on my own terms, because and I had something on in me, like I would try to play like Ray, and then I got to a point I said, well, I really can't do it. I want to. He went this way. I actually want to go this way, and that's what I ended up having these inspirations, but not verbatim, not plagiarizing, however you want to say it. But that's what I feel that's how you will get your sound, because I didn't know I had a sound until people say, man, I can recognize you. A lot of that is because I've been on a lot of recordings, and so they can associate certain things, not only the sound, but my vocabulary that I use, etc.
So you bring me to the responsibility of a bassist. And I have a quote here that bass players have the ability to sabotage every band they play in. And that there's the power and responsibility but to make the band jump. And my other question then, or the question I have that goes along with that, is when you're playing with different people, so whether you're playing with Dexter Gordon, who is a much a robust player, do you find your style changing than when you're playing with someone like, say, Stan Getz, who is more, I think the term was golden, or Benny Golson, who has a glorious sound, or Bill Evans, even. How it does a bassist have a responsibility to play to whom they're playing with, or to still, and how do you find your own sound with that? Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think too many people think too much about that. First of all, I think you do what's necessary to make the song, whatever melodies and I would say try to please the composer first, and then be consistent with whatever the role of the bassist is supposed to do, that I have that covered. I don't care if it's Dexter Gordon or Stan Getz or J.J. Johnson or Bill Evans. I still basically play the same. To play with Stan Getz, he had this golden sound, beautiful sound every time he put the horn in his mouth. So that meant I had to play as beautiful and strong and with as much clarity doing that in order. But here's the thing I think that's important. My first job is to hook up, if there is a drummer, is to hook up with the drummer. And if he or she and I come together, the piano player doesn't have a choice, I'd like to think. And then once we become the trio, the front line doesn't have a choice but to come with us. As strong as Stan Getz are, if the rhythm section was funky, he wouldn't sound as good. Trust me. But the thing for me is I learned how to play. My job is to make Stan Getz play sound better than he would ever play with anybody else. That's my job, to make him sound better with me than anybody else. So I mean, I'm fully engaged to just embrace him. And I think Kenny Barron did the same thing, and Victor Lewis, when we did those recordings with him. We embraced him, and he made us sound good. We made him sound good, And so ultimately, we have this enormous, beautiful sound, period, the group. And to me, that's my job, is to be, and that's what I think about all the time. It's up front. This is something that um, concerns me, to get the groove, whatever the song is. Uh, if it's supposed to be a somber, and but I still have to be consistent, um, um, and you know, uh, Stan didn't really like bass solos. He even told me that. He says, especially Arco, especially with the bow solos. He says, I don't really like bass solos with the bow at all. And he would tell me, he said, George Mraz, who used to play with him, who was a phenomenal player with the bow. He says, George really plays the bow well, but I didn't like his either, and I said, wow. So I have two things. If I decide to play the bow and say to hell with Stan, if I feel like, well, then I'm not being part of the group. I'm being obstinate. I mean, why would I do something like that just to um, be me, whatever that, you know? And uh, so I think that has a lot to do with just I I rock the band. To me, if I mess up, the whole thing is gone out the window. That's why I always say that, you know, the players, the bass players really have control. We have a lot of power, um, but we have a lot of responsibility to make the band pop. And whether you're playing jazz, take the take the basses out of a symphony orchestra, take the bass out of Latin music, Cuban music, Brazilian music, take the bass out of rock and roll. It's not going to be the same.
That's a really good point, and something I've talked about with some of my other interviewees is the fact that the music, especially even if it's a trio or a duo or a big band or whatever composition or size, it's an alchemy. It's truly magical. And when all these things come together, and you're all those musicians are reading one another and dialed in and creating something really special, it gets transmitted to the audience. And as a avid jazz fan and audience member, I can feel it, and it's beyond intellectual. It hits me in my
Yes,
heart, my gut.
yes. It's hard to explain. It truly is. And when it happens, that's why, the pandemic really uh, put it on everybody. I mean, the audience missed us. We missed the audience. And performing on Zoom was the worst. You know, some people were playing solo piano on Zoom. It was, and they're playing as well as they play, but it's not the same. It just doesn't come across the same, and that's why I love playing in smaller settings. I mean, that's just really how the music got born, essentially. But and then to play in the big venues and the concert halls, that became kind of a necessary evil in a sense. You can make more money, uh, which I guess is the name of the game, but it's not as satisfying because you got this big moat between the stage and the audience. Um, Even if the sound system is really good, you do well and you can get it going, but it's different. So, and I can destroy that as well, just as easily.
So I'd like to move on to the fact that you're an author, which I find as a librarian a very exciting thing. You wrote in 1974 your book, The Evolving Bassist, came out. You were encouraged by Eddie Harris to pursue that.
Right.
Um, and I think he's giving you sage advice, which you followed, in that he told you you're intelligent, you're a college graduate, you're recording with me. Why don't you write a book? And if you decide to write a book, I want you to promise me two things: that you'll finish it and you own it. And you finish it and you own it. And it's a quintessential bass book, is it not?
Well, it's still out there, and we own it. That was our first child, and it's hard to believe now that it still does exist. Uh, in the publishing world, that's kind of like, what? You know, if it were a piano book or a guitar book, uh, I'd be a millionaire times over, I think. Uh, but it's just a bass book, and yet it was needed at the time. I bought every book that was on the market at the beginning, just to because it had to be something that wasn't there. Otherwise, you don't. We got a lot of books, you know, and so I was trying to. There wasn't a jazz book, and I added talked about the bow in the book, and jazz players really, bass players, a lot of them didn't know what that was, or didn't want to know, and then playing the guitar and the bass guitar, and that's how I got started. So the two kind of go together. Um, and at that particular time, I mean, I learned it was cut and paste and all this kind of stuff way back when. And then we had pictures taken with the bass on the airplane, uh, which were beginning to be very classic uh, entities, because people that was a novel thing in that book, but it was a real thing. That's what we did, and of course now there's probably not enough room for us to even sit in a plane now. The seats are so small, but I was trying to make it a practical book. I think the reason why it still exists is because I didn't stylize the book. It's just information that can be applied to whatever style of music you play, and it was amazing. The first one of the times I went to Puerto Rico, and I met a bass player there, and he had the book, and I had this exercise in the book called tenths. It's like a major third, but up higher, octave higher on the bass. It really sounds good. And I just had this exercise, and this guy, he says, "I want to show you. You really let me. I learned this from your book." And he played one of these. I don't know what he was doing, man. It was, and then he incorporated these tenths all over. He was all over the bass, and I was going like, "Whoa, you got to teach me that." But he learned. It was something I gave him that unleashed something in him, and I said, "That's what I wanted to happen." So he could take that information and put it what made sense to him, and it floored me, and it made me feel good, of course. But that's what I was hoping that could happen from that, and I think that is really one of the major reasons why it still exists on the market, is because it was not stylized.
Right.
You know.
So it brings you, your book is a good teaching tool for you. And as a teacher, let's talk a little bit about how and why you got to William Patterson. Um, I had some notations here that you had been working with Dad Jones, and that you had not wanted to be a teacher
Right.
at all, and that he was working there, and then never showed up in the fall semester. And Dr. Martin Criven contacted you and brought you on board and you were the first full-time faculty member.
Right. Well, yeah, that's a pretty good truncated version of it. But I didn't want. I didn't come to New York to teach, but I had been teaching on one at my house in Chicago, and I enjoyed it. That, but this was different, and uh, he. Thad was being wooed by the Danish radio orchestra to go over there, and evidently they wooed him so much that he decided to stay, but he didn't tell anybody, you know. But what was interesting, Dr. Criven observed me. Like I said, you never know who's watching you, because when I was there with Thad and Mel and Harold Danko and I would do these master classes, and we would individually do our little thing, whatever. But Martin Criven was observing me, and so when Thad was unreachable, he called me, and I said, "Well, I'll come out." And my wife didn't believe I was going to go, but I went out, and actually I enjoyed the day. And then I ended up having that semester, and which was, it was okay. It was fun, and it didn't. And I told Dr. Criven, I said, the moment that anybody in the classical department says anything negative toward me, I'm out of here. Because the classical, even to this day, classical musicians or classical departments and the jazz departments really don't mix. They should, but they don't. They don't have to be in love. They just, there should be some kind of interaction. And there are certain places now that it's healthier. But so anyway, I came back after the summer, and Dr. Crivens, we talked. We got rid of the things that didn't seem to work, and the things that worked, we kept, and it just grew. And he gave me my head. He gave me the license to hire certain players to come out and teach who really wanted to share what they had. And I think that was the big deal for us, because they were players who were in the trenches in New York City, literally. And that was one of the big draws for this small university. At that time, it was a college. And many of the players would go travel all over the world and talk about William Patterson College jazz department. And therefore the reputation started to get on people's lips, and we were turning away students who wanted to come to study, because it was he wanted a direct link to the marketplace, New York City. And
you started a precedent of having professionals at the program, and then also establishing a consistency about that.
Correct. So Dr. Criven was the one who actually knew all the ins and outs of the academia in terms of what had to happen, what should happen, so that he protected us. He was our champion. He knew the president. The president of the university knew what we were trying to do, and gave us the green light to do things. And we were very visible. We were also visible enough to completely trash everything. So I had to really be careful about who I would bring out. And they had to want It's not like people wanting a gig now. They need work. They need to work. But I wanted people who wanted to share what we had, and they also got paid. But but they were actually willing to share, and I think that was the nucleus that made it work.
You were director for 20 years and retired in 1999, so it's
Yeah.
1979 to 99. Earlier this year, you received the Distinguished Faculty Staff Award, an award that recognizes individuals that demonstrate leadership in the community and are dedicated to the success of students of William Patterson. So I'm very glad that you got that.
I was very pleased to have received that, and the gala that was beautiful because it talked about that, and it talked about Dr. Criven, who was the visionary of this entire thing, and he taught my wife and I what we had to do in order to learning how to protect ourselves, and so that and it, so we're very thankful that we even got to know him really close. But he and I spoke every day at the end of the day, and students didn't know that we communicated that way but it was like it was small enough, it was, and I think that was one of the most effective things because it was so small, and I knew people's names, and I knew if I watched their face something was wrong or something, or and I think particularly it was nice to see that many of the students came back to, and they all looked healthy, and they were still thinking about their time at William Patterson being fruitful. Many of them have gone other ways, and some are still playing and staying busy. And hey, everybody is. I just want them to be healthy, and um, it was my time at William Patterson. It went faster than I thought. Um, I kept saying, "Oh, I've been here about 6 years." And my wife said, "You've been there 10 years already." And then before you know it, was 15, and then it was 20. I said, "Oh man." Um, and one of the reasons I left is because we went to see my good friend. His name was Milt Hinton, the bassist, and he was 85. I was 55. And I said, "Wow, that's 30. That's 30 years. That's almost like another career, in a sense." But because he couldn't play anymore, had become. And I said, "Oh man." Um, and I was still traveling a lot, and I was what we call dropping, juggling. I didn't drop anything, but I was juggling, and it ended up being not as healthy as it should have been. And I also was intrigued because I was recording a lot with all these great composers, and then I heard about the BMI, and I said, "Man, I want to do that." And so my wife said, "Well, it's time. When are you going to do it?" And had I not had I not done that, I never would have gotten to Guggenheim. I never would have understood about writing for the orchestra. I never would have done almost anything that I've done since then. And so I have no regrets whatsoever. In fact, it was just but my career has always been like this, as a professional player and as an educator. It's always been this way. And and they all would feed on each other too, and so.
So one of the things you had talked about in a previous interview is the fact that when you're composing, it's very easy to get in that zone, and then there's almost kind of a guilt that you're not then practicing. And they're like they're two mistresses, right? So do you give your
Right,
energy to one or do you give it to the other?
right.
And I'm a writer, and I understand completely what you're saying. And you get in that zone, and yeah, time just kind of goes into a time warp. I'm just curious though here, when you're writing, how do you prevent yourself from self-editing um, or being kind of hard on yourself? And because there's a point where you have to make a creation and then you have to let it go.
Oh, that's a good question. But I think one of the things is that you cannot be judgmental too soon about whether it's good or not, or if it's, um, are people going to like it? Uh, that has to be erased. That, I mean, that, and it took me a minute to get to that. And Bob Brookmeyer actually helped me, um, because I had, he was kind of a hard nosed teacher, um, with some of his students. And so when I won that first commission with BMI, Jim McNeely, who was a really good friend and great composer, we were doing this workshop up in Lake Placid, and he said, I want Bob to see your piece." I said, "Oh, don't show it to Bob." I didn't want, but Bob did, and so I said, "I have the score." He said, "No, I want to listen to it first." So he had headphones. We didn't have the speakers in it, so I'll never forget. Because I had been listening to this ad nauseum, so I knew this piece, and so he had the headphones on and he had his eyes closed, and he'd go along. He said, "Hmm, hmm, oh," and I'm watching all these antics. And then after he finished, he said, "Okay, let me have the score." And he listened to it again. And then he had a pencil. And then he would, oh, then he would check, and he'd turn the page, and he'd turn the page, and he'd, he'd make him. And I'm watching, and I said, "What is he doing?" And then after he finished, um, he says, "Oh, there's another side of you I didn't know existed," which was nice. And then he pointed to this one thing where he had checked. He says, "Why did you do that?" I said, "Well, it was a trombone thing. I love trombones, and it kind of reminded me of a Thad Jones kind of thing." And I said that, and he says, "I know, but why did you do that?" He said, "You can figure another way to do it." Oh, okay. So then we go on and go further, and then he turned the page and he said, "You really messed up here." I said, "What? What are you talking about?" And he says, "You gave me, I had this big, beautiful rainbow ball, and I was playing with it, and then you took it away from me, and then you didn't give me anything else to replace it with." And I said, "Oh," and that's the transition, moving from one thing to another. And I wanted to have a lesson with him. He was becoming kind of ill at the time, and he was living up near Canada, and I just never got a chance to do that. But those two things, that was a huge lesson he gave me. Two things about, if this is reminding you of something like that, you 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 got to change it. And the transition, which I think most people, whether it be books or poetry or whatever, transitions are really difficult. And when you can actually, all of a sudden you're involved, and then you're in another room and you don't know how you got there, that's that's a that's a craft. of being able to do something like that. And so I think about those two things all the time. And so playing the music on the bass and then writing, boy, I'm fighting. I'm fighting all the time, and I still feel that I play the bass best. Uh, but um, it, I don't know when it's going to happen. But I'm playing less. I'm not like when I used to, because when I was with Dexter Gordon, we were traveling 8 months out of the year, literally, and so I've had some wonderful memories and times. And I'm traveling now in a week and a half. I'm going to Chicago for a couple of weeks, and but I'm not anywhere near like I used to, and that's okay. But once I leave the bass for a week and don't play the bass for a week or two, um, she makes me feel that. Oh boy, and it takes me longer to get into a zone writing wise. This what you see is my little sanctuary, so I can come out here in the middle of the night or during the day or whenever, and I won't disturb anybody. And so when
You
I
never know
do,
when the muse is going to visit you.
yes, 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 and it's um, and I realize when I listen to some of these great masterpieces, you say, "Wow, amazing." I wonder how long it took them to do that, you know. And I'm very slow. Um, I I'm not prolific at all, but I have a lot in my head from the years of playing and being around masterful players that I can call upon. And so I'm very thankful for that. But I there was a player by the name of Hall Richard Abrams, who was a very good friend of mine, a pianist from Chicago. He and I used to play with Eddie Harris during that period that we were talking about. But he was also the founder of the AACM uh, in Chicago. And he taught me a lot about just um, he was at my senior recital. He says, "I heard you wrote something." He says, "I know you got it. Just go for it. You just listen. You just have to keep listening and listen and listen, and then just write. And then you have to get a notebook and you have to start." I said, "Oh, and I didn't know how. I was always intrigued, but now because I never studied it
Yeah.
formally, I just buy books and
Yeah.
ask questions.
May I ask what the composition was that you shared with Bob Brookmeyer?
Um, Skies over Emilia. Um, Emilia is in Italy on the Adriatic side, and I remember my wife on the anniversary had done that, and so I had a lack of names, making titles and stuff, but I chose that, and that was my first that 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 year, first year at BMI in 2000, and that was um, it was amazing because that was the piece. The judges for the commission were Slide Hampton um, and Lee Konitz and Dan Morgenstern. Do you know that name?
I
Dan
do.
Morgenstern. And so I said, wow. So at the end of the day, Dan Morgenstern came up to me. He says, "Yours was the only one I wanted to hear again," and that got me. And because when we practice our music, we want to play well enough so people can call us, and then we can play again. This is the way I think about music. I really would like to write some things that can be heard more than once. And that's difficult for a lot of composers. And some composers, I mean, there are composers incredible all over the world that don't even get it read, much less played, much less recorded. And so I feel very blessed in that regard that my music is resonating with people, you know.
I'd like to talk very briefly before we need to start wrapping this up about the Quiet Pride, the Elizabeth Catlett project, which I heard described as a musical portrait, which I like that description. And it was released in 2014 to critical acclaim, and it's a five movement suite for a large jazz ensemble, and it received two Grammy nominations for Best Large Jazz Ensemble and Best Instrumental Composition for the Recognition track. That's something to be very proud of.
Yeah, well, yes, and when I found out that it was being nominated for a Grammy, that really kind of took my head off because you, you don't you don't write music to do that. I mean, maybe some people might think they do that, but it's like I couldn't come up with something uh, so that I can get a Grammy. I don't know what that is. I mean, so I was very pleased. But I got a chance to sink my teeth into that. Was my first really big commission, Raymond Sackler Award, and through University of Connecticut up in Storrs, Connecticut, and um, so I applied for that because I just happened to be on the B. I had left BMI, um, but I was still on the mailing list, and so I got this came across my desk, and I said, "Well, I have nothing to lose. I mean, let me try it." But the trick was they wanted you to propose something. You couldn't just say, "I want to write a big band piece." You had to have a reason, and I had close friends, Jane Ira Bloom, who's a wonderful saxophonist. She wrote a lot of music based on Kandinsky and Jackson Pollock, and I even played on some of those things. And Jim McNeely wrote a whole thing based on Paul Clay's paintings, and so I had this book in my house of Elizabeth Catlett's. It was a coffee table book, which had a lot of dust on it at the time, and I began to really. I said, "Well, let me look at this," and then all of a sudden, these photographs of these sculptures and things just kind of popped. I said, "That's what I'm going to do," and then I proposed I would do that. And unbeknownst to me, I didn't think I was going to win at all. You never do. Um, and then I got this call, and the guy from the University of Connecticut says, "I'd like to congratulate you. You've been awarded the Sackler Commission, but we're very, Mr. Sackler and I are very um, intrigued because we don't really know about Elizabeth Catlett." And I said, "Ooh, that was really kind of fun for me to learn that." And and I got a chance to meet her, and we went to her home, and it was special. So the music. She unfortunately she heard the college group play it, but she never heard the professional music, which I wish she had. But
I just want to interject for those who are watching this and aren't familiar with American Elizabeth Catlett. She's an American artist who was encouraged by her teacher Grant Wood to explore different mediums, and she explored lithographs, linoleum cuts, sculpture in wood, stone, clay, and bronze. And she drew her subjects from African American, and later Mexican life. She has a very interesting life, by the way, for the fact that she moved to Mexico City, got her Mexican citizenship in '62, and then was unable to return to the United States
Right.
during the civil
Right.
rights time,
Right.
and have her U.S. Citizenship restored later on. A really fascinating woman.
Yeah, she truly was. She reminded me of my grandmother, actually. She was really something because when I first met her, she was 92, and she came to hear Kenny Barron and I and Victor Lewis. We were playing at a club called Sweet Basil in New York City, and she came out on the late set, 11 o'clock set, and she was on a walker. Her son, she has three sons. One's a drummer, and one's a filmmaker in Mexico, and one's also a painter and sculptor who lives in Germany. And it was special to meet her, and she came and invited my wife and I to visit her in Cuernavaca, and uh, she would say, "Well, you should come see me." And of course, people, I said, "Oh yeah, 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 yeah." And so after a couple weeks went by, she called the house because she was still in New York. She says, "Aren't you gonna come?" And I said, and so I looked at my wife and I said, maybe we should go. She is 92, and we did. We went and during Thanksgiving of that year, and she says, I'm gonna have turkey and dressing, and she says these Mexicans really don't know about Thanksgiving. So, and when we got to her house, she was in the kitchen making something, So we spent a week with her. It was fantastic. It was amazing to see how another artist functioned on a daily basis. It was really neat. Uh, so I
I have a
feel
notation here that the drummer Herlin Riley described Quiet Pride as tender, explosive, swinging, holds a groove, and timeless. And I also have a notation that you handpicked musicians to bring your vision to life, and that you wrote for the personalities in the band. I guess kind of like Duke Ellington.
well, yes. I mean, I think as we learn to play and play with really good people that bring you the best out of you, and you can feel it. And so here was an opportunity that was a massive one for us, as even financially, just to be able to put something like this together to people that I had played with on different, very different situations that I knew would actually bring 100% plus to the thing. And many of them never knew that I was writing. And that was even the most exciting part about that.
I want to just wrap it up with a couple things. One is I made in going through my research, I really noticed that you've had a life that's been led by serendipity.
Yes.
So you were to get you to William Patterson. You had been working with Dad Jones, and it was kind of serendipitous that you had that association, and then Dr. Criven asked you to step in, and you were there 20 years. When you were talking to Newvelle Record, it was serendipitous that that gentleman was interested in your doing jazz with string quartet.
Right.
Um, you chose Elizabeth Catlett by seeing this coffee table book, and then you later happened to meet her godson, who was a French horn player at an Eddie Allen rehearsal, and then you were able to connect with her son, Francisco, and that led you to meeting her. And then you also met the woman named Glory, for whom her sculptor is,
Right.
based
Yeah,
on.
it was amazing. It was like the stars had just lined up for me. I couldn't believe it.
I think serendipity does play a big part in your life.
Well, you've certainly done your homework, lady. That's for sure. Good for
I
you.
work hard to do that.
Yes, well, it shows. It
I
shows.
just want to share some thoughts that people have of you and how wonderful you are. So would you like to hear some compliments here?
If you must.
John Patitucci, the bassist, said, Rufus is a sage, kind, very gifted, and wise. He's helped me set my priorities about what it means to be a jazz bassist and my role as a foundational compositional personality and entertainer that he is. He's eloquent, witty, charming, and a great ambassador for the art form. Even if they know nothing about jazz, people are captivated by the natural, engaging way he presents himself and the music. And I think today's conversation truly encapsulates that. So I thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It was really my pleasure. And it truly is an honor to speak with people who really have done some research and done some homework with, because I don't really think about what I've done. I don't. It's not that I say, oh yeah, I guess I did do that. Okay, so it's a very interesting time for me at this juncture to have people be interested enough to speak with me, and it was a real pleasure. Thank you.